COVID-19 has really put a spotlight on censorship and the power of big tech. Social media platforms are completely silencing the voices of even medical experts who disagree with establishment ideology. But what about the Constitution? Do these private companies face any restrictions? Once again, constitutional attorney Daniel SHEEHAN is back to break it down.
We're in Clearwater tonight. I'm Allison Morrow.
Hi, I'm Allison Morrow.
I'm Allison Morrow.
And I've gone to a lot of places.
On St. Pete Beach, Allison Morrow.
And now with my former Force Recon Marine husband, I'm going off-grid-ish.
Bringing up this issue of the town square now that, hey, you and I, we're on YouTube, and this is where a lot of these conversations are happening now. People are organizing protests on Facebook, but you've seen the CEOs of these companies flat out say, if your dialogue or your topic violates our terms, which in some cases may mean questioning the WHO, or it may mean organizing a protest that a governor has said is violating a shelter-in-place rule, that you'll just get struck from this town square. You just cease to exist. What are the constitutional issues there? And what kind of protections do these big tech companies have versus the people? And does this need to get figured out? Will it get figured out? What are your thoughts there?
The bottom line is that these instrumentalities are not, in fact, government agencies. And so it's extremely important to understand that the specific constitutional constraints that are in the United States Constitution and apply to the federal government directly under the Constitution and apply to the state governments pursuant to the 14th Amendment are not at play here, unless you're dealing with the federal activity or state activity. So the question about whether or not they have to license these, like, for example, you don't need a license to come on right now and for us to have this conversation. Either you nor I have to have a license from any government agency to do what it is we're doing right now. But there is a private company that is providing the technological means by which to do this. Okay, but that particular corporation does not have constitutional constraints imposed upon it. Now, that having been said, you remember, well, people who saw our previous conversation will understand that the Constitution of the United States does not delegate to us or donate to us any of these fundamental rights. These fundamental rights we possess as individual citizens and as collective citizens. And we possess these rights not only over and against government, but over and against any type of combination of power that would attempt to restrict our liberties. But the devices that are available to enforce our, quote, constitutional rights inside the courts are available through the court system only over and against federal and state governments. The courts do not have the authority or the jurisdiction to impose constitutional constraints upon private groupings, whether they're the New York Times or whether they're the people who own the Facebook or anything, or these companies, Google or any of these, Wikipedia, any of these things. These are all private organizations. They're private businesses. Our argument on our behalf as citizens over and against those types of entities that are not government entities are that our fundamental human right to engage in communication, you cannot restrict that. But they're going to come back with, we're not constricting it. We're just saying that if you want to make use of our facilities that we have spent billions of dollars or millions of dollars creating and putting together, if you want to engage in that, you can do so by contract with us. And we'll make these things available to you. We'll either make them available to you under a contract for pay, so you have to pay a monthly amount to engage in it, or we've actually gone to the point of making it available to you for free, with the understanding that we garner all of your information that we can get from you and we sell it to people who want to sell you things. And we sell this to businesses. And you either agree to compromise yourself to that extent or you don't. And almost everybody does. Fine, sure, who cares? I want to be able to talk to my friends on Facebook about, what my favorite color is, in exchange for you having the right to sell that information about my favorite color to groups that might be interested financially in it, And so that whole issue of contract law and the rights that we give up in order to get access to the resources that someone else has put their time and energy into to generating in the form of some technological expertise that they have or product that they have is under contract law. It's under contract law. Now, there are in fact some limitations on that. And this is the important area we need to look at. That the courts have been invoked to say that, look, even under contract law, if the owner of the company wants to come to a court and try to assert certain rights, for example, to impose the obligation that if you're going to use Facebook, they have to have the right to sell your property to whoever they want to, right? Sell your face, your visage, your information, and then courts have this whole area where they've said there are certain unconscionable contracts that have become unconscionable. And therefore, the state takes upon itself the right to intervene to stop the enforcement or refuse to lend any hand in the enforcement of an unconscionable contract. Okay? And that's an area where this has come to play here, that the pressure's been put on by the citizenry around the country who are upset at Google or upset with one of the other major companies, saying the government should do something about this. You need to be extraordinarily careful about invoking the power of the state, whether it's a state government or federal government, invoking the power of the state to come in and intervene in the private relationships between people. But the bottom line is that there are certain very limited areas where the government, federal government, in delegating authority to the state governments pursuant to the 14th Amendment, have taken unto themselves the right to intervene in the right to contract. The right to contract is one of the fundamental rights that's set forth in the American Constitution, that the government is prohibited from invading the right to contract. This fight went on between Franklin Roosevelt and the major corporations in 1934, when the Roosevelt administration attempted to impose all kinds of restrictions on corporations and businesses, that they had to allow labor unions, for example, to organize. They couldn't break the unions inside their companies. And the corporations fought back, saying they were people, they had fundamental rights, and this was a violation of their right to contract. Roosevelt prevailed in that particular instance, but only by threatening to pack the United States Supreme Court in that particular case. So that hasn't been effectively resolved in our country. This whole question about the authority on the part of the state, writ large, state and federal government, to intervene to regulate the conduct of private businesses like Google or like Facebook or the other things. So that has been opened by the Roosevelt administration to craft this entire set of rules and regulations that have set caveats on what can be done in businesses. And as long as a corporation exists and has this type of immunity to its stockholders and its management, then I don't have a great deal of concern about the government overreaching into the conduct of private businesses. I do if in fact, but then the problem arises, what if those businesses are like the New York Times or NBC News or CNN or MSNBC? Those are private companies. And if the government tries to intervene and say, you can't say this or you have to do this, then you've got First Amendment problems. And these First Amendment problems do come into play here with regard to Google and Facebook and everything else. So that this is an extremely complicated area of law, and the lawyers are still engaged in trying to sort out how these traditional principles apply to this new modern technology. I think as citizens, what we want to be able to do is constantly advocate that we have as much freedom as possible to communicate with each other, to say whatever it is we want to say to each other over communications like this, to do whatever organizing we want to do. But we're going to run into the classic examples, and we've all engaged in this, that they're going to say, wait a second, what about child pornography? You can't allow child pornography to be conveyed over the internet. So, and people shouldn't have the right to tune into child pornography. This is an area which is so intrinsically offensive to the vast majority of the population that we're going to agree that the government can invade this territory and start to set up prohibitions against certain kind of things you can't say or do on the internet. Okay, and again, you got to be extraordinarily careful about that, extraordinarily guarded about letting the government get into this just because they have bad facts. This is a bad factual situation. Everybody gets upset about this, but you can't compromise fundamental constitutional principles just because you happen to get upset about this. What you need to do is go track down the people that are actually producing child pornography and arrest them and put them in jail. You have a right to do that. But it's not clear you have a right to stop people from doing something on the internet, which is basically getting the nose of the camel under the tent. And you know that's what's going on the part of the federal government. They're flogging around this issue of child pornography or terrorism, and they're going to try to get at our First Amendment rights, which we have to be very careful about not letting them do.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point because it typically tends to start with something that like everybody can agree on, and then it slowly, insidiously becomes, well, what about this as being dangerous, or this is immoral, or whatever else, and then now you get to the point where you have violating terms means you question the World Health Organization. It is sort of a creeping process. So somebody like me does, as much as I get frustrated at YouTube for demonetizing and censoring some of my videos that they have determined are dangerous because it talks about cannabis not getting federal stimulus money, for instance, was one of my videos that was demonetized for whatever reason. I don't want to go the other path either because I follow that to its end and see where we could potentially end up, and that doesn't seem very tasteful to me either. So I don't know, but it's a great question.
Well, but that's why you have constitutional lawyers. That we can help only because it doesn't change your subjective opinions. What it does is it allows you to structure your subjective opinions so you know how far to exercise them in particular directions and in particular cases. That's what good lawyering is really all about, to help you articulate your feelings and discern your feelings with regard to things when they tend to be mixed. To separate them out and think about what it is you need to do, and then figure out what forum you need to go to, whether it's the public forum of trying to mobilize mass support of people, or go to the state legislatures, or go to the courts, write letters to your congressperson. There's all kinds of different ways, and we want to keep those completely open. All of the different ways that we have as citizens to demand our rights, to insist upon our rights, and when necessary to enforce our own rights has to be maximized. And that we understand. Okay, and and it's funny, it's very hard for people to classify us constitutional lawyers as to whether we're left or right, because we're basically insisting upon utilizing the structures of the government that we have right now, which is really quite conservative. It's kind of a conservative modality. But when we're also saying that we have a right to mobilize, we have a right to gather in public, we have a right to come onto the internet and say whatever it is we want to say or do, and ultimately we have the right to resort to armed revolution against the government if we want to. And then the argument goes up is, do we have the right to organize and advocate armed revolution over the internet? These are all questions that are extremely important for us to preserve, okay, and to address. And again, the extraordinary opportunity that's presented to us by this particular situation that we're in, this particular pandemic, and the particular responses that the federal government and the state government have undertaken in response to it, are an extraordinary learning opportunity. This is a great learning moment to try to reflect upon the fundamental principles of our Constitution, the structures of our government, the respective powers of the federal government versus the state government, the respective authority of we as citizens to do what we want to do and say what we want to do and go where we want to go under the circumstances we want to. These are the types of moments where people actually pay attention to those kind of issues. Otherwise, they're all abstract and theoretical and hypothetical. And people, frankly, have better things to do than to spend a lot of their time thinking about these things. But the time has come to think about a lot of these things right now. And very importantly, we can't just have all one side of the conversation taking place on Fox News and everybody on the other side just listening to themselves on MSNBC. We've got to try to have some sort of unified dialogue system going on where we can all get access to the same information, we can get access to the same arguments on all sides of the issue, and hear people who have concrete interests in the outcome of this dialogue be represented in an intelligent way. Now, there's an old program that was on years ago. It was called Our Constitution in Crisis, I think, and it was Fred Friendly put it on PBS, and they would actually bring people in. Former secretaries of state, former presidents, judges, they would all come and they would sit around these big tables and they would have a law professor going around putting hypotheticals to them to ask them questions about how they would respond given the experience that they've had in this thing. The delicate balance. Our Constitution, that delicate balance was the name of this program. And I would recommend it to all your listeners. You can find it on YouTube, I'm sure.
One of the most unfortunate parts of our culture right now is that many people think that if you talk about something or you ask a question, you are thereby
advocating.
Advocating it, or you've somehow crossed this line of immorality. And you're not one of us anymore. And that tribalism is very damaging, I think, because why?
That's right.
Why can't you at least just talk about it? And then, hey, if you end up finding out more information through your discussions that changes your mind, then that should be a good thing. That should be something you want to do with your adversary, would be converse and debate and change their mind, not necessarily just...
or change your mind.
Yeah, or end up changing. Yeah, exactly.
We're all perfectly prepared to change someone else's mind.
Right. Very true.
But your own mind.
Perhaps it's just been an outcome of social media itself and the way that we converse on social media that the unfriending and the if you think this, and it's a one-way street in a lot of ways, and maybe that's just turned us into these terrible debaters who are getting very emotional over these topics instead of having logical conversations. So thank you for bringing that up. I talked to Mr. Sheehan about several other issues related to the constitutionality of rules around the COVID-19 pandemic. If you want to check those out, look at the description below this video and click those links. Remember, a lot of the videos that are being produced right now about COVID-19 are being shadow banned, censored, demonetized. So please share this video with others that you think might be interested. Again, I'm Allison Morrow, and I will see you next time.